Do rich fathers have rich sons, and poor fathers have poor sons? Or is there no relationship between the two? And at the more unequal end, father's income is much more important. In the UK, USA, and in countries, the Scandinavian countries, father's income is much less important. There's more social mobility. And as we like to say, and I know there are a lot of Americans in the audience here, if Americans want to live the American dream, they should go to Denmark. I've shown you just a few things in italics here. I could have shown you a number of other problems. They're all problems that tend to be more common at the bottom of the social gradient. But there are endless problems with social gradients that are worse in more unequal countries. Not just a little bit worse, but anything from twice as common to 10 times as common. Think of the expense, the human cost of that. I want to go back, though, to this graph that I showed you earlier, where we put it all together, to make 2 points. One is that in graph after graph, we find that the countries that do worst, whatever the outcome, seem to be the more unequal ones. And the ones that do well seem to be the Nordic countries and Japan. So what we're looking at is general social dysfunction related to inequality. It's not just 1 or 2 things that go wrong, it's most things. The other really important point I want to make on this graph is that if you look at the bottom, Sweden and Japan, they're very different countries in all sorts of ways. The position of women, how closely they keep to the nuclear family. They're at opposite ends of the poles in terms of the rich developed world. But another really important difference is how they get their greater equality. Sweden has huge differences in earnings, and it narrows the gap through taxation, generous welfare states, generous benefits, and so on. Japan is rather different, though. It starts off with much smaller differences in earnings before tax. It has lower taxes. It has a smaller welfare state. And in our analysis of the American states, we find rather the same contrast. There are some states that do well through redistribution, some states that do well because they have smaller income differences before tax. So we conclude that it doesn't much matter how you get your greater equality as long as you get there somehow. I'm not talking about perfect equality, I'm talking about what exists in rich, developed market democracies. Another really surprising part of this picture is that it's not just the poor who are affected by inequality. There seems to be some truth in John Donne's "No man is an island." In a number of studies, it's possible to compare how people do in more and less equal countries at each level in the social hierarchy. This is just one example. It's infant mortality. Some Swedes very kindly classified a lot of their infant deaths according to the British Registrar General's socioeconomic classification. And so it's anachronistically a classification by father's occupation, so single parents go on their own. But then the low, where it says low social class, that's unskilled manual occupations. It goes through towards the skilled manual occupations in the middle, then the junior non-manual, going up the high to the professional occupations, doctors, lawyers, directors of larger companies. You see there that Sweden does better than Britain all the way across the social hierarchy. The biggest differences are at the bottom of society, but even at the top, there seems to be a small benefit to being in a more equal society. We show that on about 5 different sets of data covering educational outcomes and health in the United States and internationally. And that seems to be the general picture, that greater equality makes most difference at the bottom, but has some benefit even at the top. But I should say a few words about what's going on. I think I'm looking and talking about the psychosocial effects of inequality, more to do with feelings of superiority and inferiority, of being valued and devalued, respected and disrespected. And of course, those feelings of the status competition that comes out of that drives the consumerism in our society. It also leads to status insecurity. We worry more about how we're judged and seen by others, whether we're regarded as attractive, clever, all that kind of thing. the social evaluative judgments increase, the fear of those social evaluative judgments. Interestingly, some parallel work going on in social psychology. Some people reviewed 208 different studies in which volunteers had been invited into a psychological laboratory and had their stress hormones, their responses to doing stressful tasks measured. And in the review, what they were interested in seeing is what kind of stressors most reliably raise levels of cortisol, the central stress hormone. And the conclusion was it was tasks that included social evaluative threats to self-esteem or social status in which others can negatively judge your performance. Those kind of stressors have a very particular effect on the physiology of stress. Now, we have been criticized. Of course, there are people who dislike this stuff and people who find it very surprising. I should tell you, though, that when people criticize us for picking and choosing data, we never pick and choose data. We have an absolute rule that if our data source has data for one of the countries we're looking at, it goes into the analysis. Our data source decides whether it's reliable data. We don't. Otherwise, that would introduce bias. What about other countries? There are 200 studies of health in relation to income inequality in the academic peer-reviewed journals. This isn't confined to these countries here, providing a very simple demonstration of the same countries, the same measure of inequality, one problem after another. Why don't we control for other factors? Well, we've shown you that GNP per capita doesn't make any difference. And of course, others using more sophisticated methods in the literature have controlled for poverty and education and so on. What about causality? Correlation in itself doesn't prove causality. We spend a good bit of time, and indeed people know the causal links quite well in some of these outcomes. The big change in our understanding of drivers of health in the rich developed world is how important chronic stress from social sources is, affecting the immune system, the cardiovascular system. Or, for instance, the reason why violence becomes more common in more unequal societies is because people are sensitive to being looked down on. I should say that to deal with this, we've got to deal with the post-tax things and the pre-tax things. We've got to constrain income, the bonus culture, incomes at the top. I think we must make bosses accountable to their employees in any way we can. I think the take-home message, though, is that we can improve the real quality of human life by reducing the differences in incomes between us. Suddenly we have a handle on the psychosocial well-being of whole societies, and that's exciting. Thank you.